And welcome to the 200th episode of the Bullvine Podcast. I'm Bella, and today, as always, I am joined by Douglas. We've got a hot topic today, quite literally.
That's right, Bella. Today, we're diving deep into what might be the dairy industry's most overlooked profit lever, strategic rumen buffer implementation during heat stress. We'll be covering how this approach can deliver returns of over 1,000%, why it matters to operations of all sizes, and exactly how producers can implement this strategy before summer hits.
I've been hearing chatter about this at several industry events. Apparently, there's new research suggesting that heat stress is costing the U.S. dairy industry around $1.5 billion annually. That's billion with a B.
Exactly. And we're not just talking about cows being uncomfortable. We're talking about a silent profit killer that's draining approximately $9.60 per cow daily during heat stress periods. Our listeners could be losing thousands, even millions, over a decade without realizing it.
Let's break this down for our listeners. In the next hour, we'll cover the science behind rumen pH management, the different buffer options available, and the economics that make this such a compelling investment. Ready to dive in?
As ready as a Holstein at feeding time. Let's get started.
Douglas, before we talk about buffers specifically, can you explain to our listeners what's actually happening inside a cow's rumen during heat stress? I think many producers see panting cows, but don't fully understand the metabolic cascade that follows.
Good point, Bella. Think of a cow's rumen as a sophisticated fermentation system, essentially a biological brewery. Inside that rumen live trillions of microorganisms that convert feed into volatile fatty acids, or VFAs, which provide 70 to 80% of a dairy cow's energy requirements.
So it's like each cow is carrying around her own personal brewery. I've heard that maintaining the right pH in this environment is critical. What's the ideal range?
For optimal rumen function, pH should stay between 6.2 and 6.8. That's the sweet spot where fiber-digesting bacteria thrive. When pH drops below 5.8 for extended periods, typically 3 hours or more, cows develop what we call subacute ruminal acidosis, or SARA.
And SARA isn't something producers can easily see, correct? It's not like a cow with a fever or visible illness.
Exactly. That's what makes it so dangerous. SARA silently sabotages feed efficiency and profitability. I like how Dr. Mark Johnson from the University of Wisconsin Dairy Science put it. A cow's rumen is like a brewery. Too much acid and the entire operation shuts down. Buffers are the bouncers keeping the microbial mosh pit in check.
That's quite the visual. So when heat stress enters the picture, what specific changes happen in the rumen?
Heat stress creates a perfect storm through three main mechanisms. First, we see what I call saliva shutdown. Research shows that heat-stressed cattle experience up to a 40% reduction in saliva production, which significantly lowers their natural buffering capacity.
That's a huge reduction. What else happens?
Second, we have respiratory bicarbonate loss. All that panting you see during heat stress isn't just about cooling. With each breath, cows are actually exhaling bicarbonate, depleting their blood's natural pH buffering system.
So they're losing their internal antacid system, so to speak.
Exactly. And third, we see feed behavior sabotage. Heat-stressed cows typically eat less forage but may consume more concentrates when they do eat, creating a higher acid load in the rumen. Research shows feed intake typically drops by 8 to 12% or more during heat stress.
And so we have less natural buffer from saliva, active loss of bicarbonate through panting, and changes in eating patterns that increase acid production. That sounds like the perfect recipe for acidosis.
It absolutely is. And when you add up all the economic losses from reduced milk production, lower components, increased health issues, and reproductive problems, we're looking at that $1.5 billion annual impact across the U.S. dairy industry that we mentioned earlier.
Let's talk solutions. I understand there are several different buffer options available to producers. Can you walk us through the main types and when each might be most appropriate?
The buffer world breaks down into a few main categories, each with specific applications. First up is sodium bicarbonate, which accounts for approximately 65% of global buffer usage in dairy nutrition, according to Dairy Global's 2024 industry report.
That's the same as baking soda, right? How exactly does it work in the rumen?
Yes, chemically it's the same compound. When sodium bicarbonate enters the rumen, it dissociates into sodium and bicarbonate ions. The bicarbonate quickly neutralizes excess hydrogen ions, which are what make the rumen acidic and stabilizes pH.
What kind of production responses can producers expect?
Research by Harrison and colleagues published earlier this year showed that proper sodium bicarbonate supplementation increases acetate production by 12% and boosts milk fat percentage by 0.14% on average. The recommended inclusion rate is between 0.8% and 1.2% of dietary dry matter.
Any dangers of overfeeding it?
Good question. You don't want to exceed 1.5% of dietary dry matter as you risk sodium overload, which creates its own set of problems, including excessive water consumption and mineral imbalances.
I've also heard a lot about potassium carbonate lately, especially for summer feeding programs. What's the story there?
Potassium carbonate is what I consider the heat stress specialist in the buffer world. It serves dual functions as both a buffer and a critical electrolyte replacement. According to 2024 research from the USDA Agricultural Research Service, heat-stressed cattle can lose up to 59% of their potassium reserves through altered perspiration and urination patterns.
59%. That's substantial.
It's dramatic. And the results from supplementing with potassium carbonate during heat stress are equally dramatic. Zhang and colleagues documented that when the temperature-humidity index, or THI, exceeds 72, herds supplemented with potassium carbonate show 30% reduction in respiration rates, 0.3% increase in milk fat percentage, and improved dry matter intake.
How much potassium carbonate are we talking about?
The sweet spot is between 0.5 and 0.7% of dietary dry matter, which translates to approximately 1 to 1.4 kilograms per cow daily during heat stress periods.
What about other buffer options? I sometimes hear about magnesium oxide and calcium carbonate.
These play supporting roles in comprehensive buffer programs. Calcium carbonate provides moderate buffering above pH 6.0 while also supporting calcium requirements. Magnesium oxide functions as both a buffer and ruminal modifier, though inclusion should be limited to 0.4% of dietary dry matter to avoid negative impacts on fiber digestion, as shown in research by Mertens published this year.
For our listeners who might want a quick reference, let me summarize the main buffer types. Sodium bicarbonate for everyday use at 0.8 to 1.2% of dry matter. Potassium carbonate for heat stress periods at 0.5 to 0.7%. And magnesium oxide as a supplement at no more than 0.4%. Would you say that covers the basics?
That's an excellent summary, Bella. I'd also mention that for organic producers, options like biochar are showing promise, with research demonstrating an 18% increase in butyrate production at inclusion rates of about 0.15 pounds per cow daily.
Now let's talk about something I find fascinating, but that many producers might not fully understand. DCAD management. Can you explain what DCAD is and why it matters during heat stress?
DCAD stands for dietary cation-anion difference. It's essentially a formula that helps us balance the positively charged ions or cations against the negatively charged ions or anions in the diet. The formula is typically expressed as sodium plus potassium minus chloride minus sulfur.
So we're basically comparing certain minerals in the diet to achieve an optimal balance.
Exactly. And during heat stress, this balance becomes critically important. Brazilian dairy consultant Luis Fernandez put it well when he said, "It's like asking the cow to run a marathon while breathing through a straw. DCAD management? That's the oxygen mask."
What happens to DCAD requirements during heat stress?
Research from Staples and colleagues published in 2024 shows that increasing DCAD from standard levels of positive 250 milliequivalents per kilogram of dry matter to elevated levels of positive 400 milliequivalents per kilogram during heat stress produces substantial performance benefits.
What kind of benefits are we talking about?
Their research documented dry matter intake increases of 1.2 kilograms per day, milk yield improvements of 2.4 kilograms per day, and reduced inflammation markers, including 27% lower urinary cobalt excretion.
So DCAD management is essentially about creating the right electrolyte balance to help cows cope with heat stress.
That's right. When we increase dietary sodium and potassium while carefully managing chloride and sulfur, we help cows maintain proper blood pH balance despite the respiratory alkalosis that heat stress can cause.
How can producers monitor whether their DCAD strategy is working?
The simplest method is urine pH testing. For lactating cows on a positive DCAD diet, you want to see urine pH between 7.0 and 8.0. This confirms appropriate DCAD levels and indicates the cow's acid-base balance is in the target range.
It's interesting how the dairy industry sometimes gets fixated on certain solutions while overlooking others. Many producers will spend hundreds of dollars on genetic improvements for small gains, but might hesitate to invest in buffer strategies that could deliver much bigger returns during challenging periods.
You've hit on something important there, Bella. The industry's obsession with genetic solutions has sometimes overshadowed metabolic management as the true profit lever. While your neighbor spends $300 per head chasing genetic improvements yielding maybe 2% more milk, you could invest $48 per head in buffer strategies that deliver 10% production increases during heat stress periods.
When you put it that way, it seems like an obvious choice.
That's exactly right. And with payback periods as short as 3 to 4 days during peak heat stress, there's very little financial risk involved.
Let's get practical. If a producer is convinced by the economics and science, how exactly should they implement a buffer strategy? What are the steps?
I recommend a 3-step approach that works regardless of herd size. Step 1 is what I call mix buffers like a profit-maximizing chef. For maximum returns during heat stress, you want to blend sodium bicarbonate at 0.8 to 1.2% of dietary dry matter. That's approximately 1.6 to 2.4 pounds per cow daily, with potassium carbonate at 0.5 to 0.7% of dry matter, or about 1 to 1.4 kilograms per cow daily.
And that combination gives you both immediate pH stabilization from the sodium bicarbonate and the electrolyte replacement from the potassium carbonate, correct?
Exactly. It's a 1-2 punch against heat stress.
What's step 2?
Step 2 is leverage forage for maximum effect. Buffer effectiveness significantly increases when paired with adequate physically effective fiber. You want to target forage with greater than or equal to 30% neutral detergent fiber, or NDF, to promote chewing activity and natural saliva production.
So the buffers work better when cows have enough fiber to stimulate their own natural buffering system through saliva.
Precisely. Research shows that high-quality forage reduces the negative effects of heat stress by requiring less total dry matter intake to maintain a balanced ration, while you never want to reduce fiber levels below 18%.
And step 3?
Step 3 is critical. Monitor like your mortgage depends on it. You need to track 3 key metrics consistently. First, rumen pH, with a target range of 6.0 to 6.5, ideally measured with bolus sensors if available. Second, milk fat percentage, with 3.8 to 4.2% indicating proper rumen function. And third, urine pH, with 7.0 to 8.0 confirming appropriate DCAD levels.
For producers who don't have access to rumen boluses, what alternatives do they have for monitoring pH?
Great question. Milk fat depression is actually one of the earliest warning signs of SARA. If you see a sudden drop of 0.3 percentage points or more in milk fat, that's a red flag. Additionally, observing manure consistency can help. Loose, bubbly manure often indicates acidosis issues.
Are there any seasonal adjustments producers should make to their buffer protocols?
Absolutely. As THI increases, buffer inclusion rates should increase correspondingly. At THI between 65 and 68, basic sodium bicarbonate at 0.8% dry matter is typically sufficient. When THI reaches 68 to 72, add potassium carbonate at 0.5%. For THI 72 to 78, implement the full protocol with DCAD at positive 350 to 400 milliequivalents per kilogram dry matter. And for extreme heat over 78, maximum buffer rates plus additional cooling interventions become necessary.
So it's really about matching the intensity of your intervention to the level of heat stress challenge.
Exactly. Buffer management isn't one size fits all. It requires adjustment based on conditions, which is why monitoring is so critical.
Let's look ahead a bit. What emerging technologies might make buffer management even more effective in the coming years?
This is where things get really interesting, Bella. While many producers are still measuring buffers with coffee cans, forward-thinking dairy operations are deploying precision technology that multiplies buffer effectiveness.
In hand, what kind of technologies are we talking about?
One of the most promising is Rumen temperature monitoring through bolus technology. New research demonstrates that Rumen temperature boluses can effectively identify and predict heat stress events before visible symptoms appear. Using machine learning algorithms, these systems enable proactive rather than reactive buffer management.
So producers could potentially increase buffer inclusion rates before cows even show signs of heat stress.
Exactly. A 2024 study on these monitoring systems noted, the success of this approach is encouraging, as the scale and variable nature of farming outdoors in temperate climates has to date limited the development of our understanding and management of thermal stress among dairy cattle in these systems.
What about labor considerations? Many of our listeners are dealing with workforce challenges.
That's a critical point. With 70% of U.S. dairy operations facing labor shortages, according to USDA Economic Research Service data from 2024, automated buffer delivery systems aren't just convenient, they're essential for consistent implementation.
What kinds of systems are available?
Systems like Trioliet SmartFlow can reduce labor requirements by approximately 3 hours daily while improving measurement accuracy and reducing buffer waste. The technology essentially takes the human variability out of the equation.
Any other innovations on the horizon?
Several exciting developments are in the pipeline. Rumen-protected buffer formulations that resist immediate dissolution are in beta testing with expected availability in 2026. These provide sustained pH support for 8+ hours compared to conventional buffers' 5-hour effectiveness.
That sounds like a significant improvement.
We're also seeing AI-enhanced monitoring systems that predict acidosis events before critical pH thresholds are crossed, with 97% prediction accuracy. These are actually already available as of this month, March 2025. Looking further ahead, weather-integrated DCAD systems that connect forecasting data with automated feed mixing equipment are in development for projected 2027 release. These will adjust buffer formulations based on predicted environmental conditions.
So the buffer technology landscape is really evolving rapidly.
It absolutely is. And these technologies will further enhance the already impressive ROI of buffer strategies.
There's another angle to buffer management that we haven't discussed yet, the potential consumer marketing benefits. Can you talk about how buffer strategies might translate to premium pricing opportunities?
This is a key point that many producers overlook, Bella. Today's dairy consumers aren't just buying milk, they're buying values. Research from the Animal Welfare Institute released earlier this year indicates that 68% of dairy consumers will pay premium prices for products with digestive comfort or animal welfare claims.
So there's a direct marketing opportunity from implementing buffer strategies.
Absolutely. Implementing comprehensive buffer strategies produces measurable welfare improvements that translate directly to marketable benefits. For instance, Proper buffer management typically reduces lameness rates from 25% down to 12% and decreases early lactation culling from 18% to 15.3%.
How might producers translate these benefits into actual premium pricing?
Some forward-thinking processors are already developing Rumen Care certified or similar marketing claims, generating premiums of approximately 20 cents per gallon. The 2025 Dairy Consumer Report notes that 42% of Generation Z consumers actively research cow comfort metrics before making purchasing decisions.
So beyond the direct production benefits, there could be additional value capture through consumer-facing claims.
Exactly. It's about positioning your dairy to capture the growing consumer willingness to pay for welfare and sustainability attributes.
And implementing buffer strategies actually delivers genuine welfare improvements. So it's not just marketing spin. It's a real benefit that happens to have marketing value.
That's the key point. It's authentic improvement that consumers are increasingly willing to pay for.
We've covered a lot of ground today, Douglas. Let me try to pull together the key points for our listeners. Strategic buffer implementation during heat stress can deliver returns of over 1,000% by maintaining rumen health when temperatures rise. The basic protocol combines sodium bicarbonate for pH stabilization with potassium carbonate for electrolyte replacement, all while managing DCAD levels for optimal metabolic function.
And the economic case is compelling. Approximately 48 cents per cow daily investment, potentially returning $4.80 or more in additional milk value during moderate heat stress, plus reduced health costs and potential marketing premiums.
The evidence is clear that buffer management represents one of the highest return investments available to dairy producers today, with benefits extending well beyond just milk production to overall herd health and consumer perception.
If there are 3 takeaways I'd want listeners to remember, they would be: first, implement baseline buffer protocols with regular monitoring of key indicators. Second, consult with your nutritionist this week about optimizing DCAD levels for current and projected conditions. And third, investigate emerging buffer technologies that can enhance effectiveness while reducing labor requirements.
In the increasingly competitive dairy landscape, effective buffer management isn't just a nice-to-have supplement. It's the difference between operations that barely survive and those that thrive despite environmental challenges.
Are you ready to stop flushing profits down the drain? The time to act is now, because while you're listening to this podcast, your competition might already be making the move.
That's all for this episode of the Bullvine Podcast. If you found this information valuable, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and visit www.thebullvine.com for more industry-leading content. Until next time, I'm Bella.
And I'm Douglas. Thanks for listening.